I'd now like to introduce our first keynote speaker. Ronald Hutton is Professor of History at Bristol University and Gresham Professor of Divinity at London. He's the author of numerous books, including Triumph of the Moon, A History of Modern Pagan Witchcraft, and more recently, Queens of the Wild, Pagan Goddesses in Christian Europe. And Ronald Hutton is going to be speaking about Sir James Frazer. Thank you, Ronald.
Thank you, Caroline, for such a kind introduction. Hello, everybody. In tackling my subject, I have to reckon with two superlatives: the most famous anthropologist in the history of the world and the most famous book of anthropology in it. Frazer was the most heavily decorated British anthropologist of all time, becoming a knight and a member of the Order of Merit and a fellow of both the Royal Society and the British Academy. In other words, officially recognized as in the top 0.5% of both the nation's science and art scholars. Things are, however, not quite that simple. As shall be seen, the much-honoured Frazer was actually one of the most unworldly of men. And the Golden Bough is not really one book, but four, each very different from the others. This is because Frazer spent a total of half his life writing it, constantly bringing out new versions with more research and rather different ideas in them. First came the 2-volume edition in 1890, then the 3-volume one in 1900, and then the 12-volume one between 1911 and 1915. And finally, as has been said by Professor Parkin, he agreed to publish a single book in 1922 with material from all those 12 condensed into it and no source references. And this is the one that the general public has known ever since as the Golden Bough, and it's still in print. So let me now consider what I think to be the major themes of Frazer's life. The first is upward social mobility. He was born in 1854 as the eldest of 4 children of a Glasgow chemist who rose spectacularly to become a partner in one of the nation's foremost pharmaceutical companies. Frazer's dad expected James to carry on the family business, but supported his son when he chose an academic career instead. Frazer could make that choice because he not only had a father now rich enough to pay his university fees, but because he was himself seriously bright. He was sent first to a local academy and then to Glasgow University. Scottish universities in those days were more like modern sixth form colleges, and Frazer studied at Glasgow's between the ages of 15 and 20. He emerged covered in academic glory and with an ambition to go to a leading university in England to study the most respected of humanities subjects, classics. His father preferred Cambridge because Oxford was the more strongly associated with the Church of England, and his father was very much a patriotic ex-Presbyterian Scot. Frazer duly won a scholarship at the largest Cambridge college, Trinity, and settled there for life. He graduated second out of all the classic students in the university in his year, and was awarded the next step in the academic ladder, a research fellowship at his own college. Now, a research fellowship is a low-grade post designed for a young scholar with an inexpensive lifestyle, to be held for a few impecunious and free years before moving on to a full-scale teaching and administrative job. Frazer simply never moved on. His research fellowship just got renewed every few years. as he was inoffensive in college life and an increasingly respected author, until at last it became permanent, but not with any more money. The second theme I find in his life is acute personal shyness. There is no apparent reason for this. He had a happy childhood in a loving family, and though rather short, at a few inches over 5 feet, was physically very strong and fit, and also good looking. He wore a bushy moustache and mutton chop whiskers when young, and a smart spade-shaped beard, which you've seen on the screen, when old. His one physical affliction was weak eyes. He always had to wear glasses, and in later middle age had to suffer successive eye operations, and he went completely blind at the age of 77. He was reading a speech at a formal dinner when both his eyes suddenly went red as the blood vessels burst, and he never regained his sight. For most of his life, however, he had no trouble in seeing and reading, and his spectacles added to his scholarly air. Even when he went blind, he continued to publish new work for another 10 years, using assistants and amanuenses to read source material to him, and then to take dictation. It could be that his introversion was just another accident of genetics, or it could be it was due to having an appallingly self-confident, loud, and pugnacious father. Certainly, Frazer rapidly adopted religious and political attitudes, which were at the polar opposite from his dad's. It may be that he formed his attitudes to human company as a reaction as well. Whatever his reason, he turned into a classic recluse, introvert, and bookworm. He liked nothing better than to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, alone in his library. I stress it was his library, not the university one. He insisted on buying practically every book and journal that he consulted for his studies, to make the latter as easily as possible, and to avoid the distraction of seeing other human beings. Quite early in his career, the sheer weight of his books caused the floor of his college room to sag, so that the ceiling of the rooms below looked alarmingly like a sail bellying out in a wind. The books concerned were in 9 languages, because he could read Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Dutch. If his capacity for study was extraordinary, so was his literary output. Another leading anthropologist, of whom we just heard, R.R. Merritt, declared that Frazer could write faster than his colleagues could read. By contrast, he hated teaching, public speaking, and management, and did hardly any. Increasingly, he simply hated conversation, nor did he read any newspapers, even in times of national crisis. He simply had no interest in current affairs. What he really enjoyed doing was communicating with people in writing, both as a published author and as a writer of letters. He could be a formidable controversialist. Like a lot of people who are meek or frightened when face to face with other humans, he could be savage when dealing with them on paper. The remarkably modest, restrained, and courteous letters that have just very accurately been read to us are unhappily not consistent through his career. And his attitude to criticism may have been helped by the fact that increasingly he avoided reading any seriously negative reviews of his work. His general unworldliness extended to more personal matters. He once, in late middle age, attended a lecture by an anthropologist at Cambridge who said that some Australian Aboriginal rock paintings of women were not intended as realistic because they were portrayed with external genitalia. At this point, Frazer burst out from the audience. "My God, you mean they haven't got them?" I pass on to another illustration of his life, his atheism. His father was a devout Scottish Presbyterian Christian. I called him an ex-Presbyterian because he had liberal views and dissented from some of the tenets of his church, but he retained a fundamentalist faith in Christ. And Frazer grew up in a family atmosphere of intense piety. Somehow, during his teens, he turned quietly and undramatically into a lifelong skeptic and rationalist with an acute hatred of religion in general and Christianity in particular. His mission in life became one to convert people in general away from both and towards a faith in science. That is why he made religion his chief object of study as a scholar, with a view to destroying it. His great distinction is that he became one of the first scholars, and soon the top one, to apply to the history of religion two of the great conceptual tools of the 19th century. One of those was the theory of evolution. The other was the unprecedented amount of detailed information about other parts of the world made possible by the rapid expansion of European colonial empires. These had a terrific and lasting beneficial effect on the knowledge of human anatomy and of zoology, botany, and linguistics. Family trees could now be formed, showing the relationships of races, animal and plant species, and languages across the world. Frazer's hypothesis was that if human bodies were basically the same all over the planet, then human minds must be as well, and must evolve everywhere according to the same predestined evolutionary pattern. This being so, by comparing religious ideas and customs from every continent and every age, he believed it possible to show how what he regarded as the delusion of religion had developed. In doing this, he intended from the beginning to reach the widest possible public. He was an evangelical preacher. To do so, he not only wrote in a colorful and elevated literary style, but actually specified the cover design, type size and face, make of paper, number of lines per page, and kind of printing press for his books. And his publisher actually agreed. He wanted the glossiest effect. This mission propelled him to achieve a number of scholarly firsts. No one before him had ever studied religion by comparing data from all over the human race on a grand scale. No one before him had discussed the European and Near Eastern ancient world primarily as a source of primitive religious attitudes. The linchpin of the Golden Bough, as everybody knows, is a unique ancient Roman custom observed at one sacred grove at Nemi in the mountains near Rome. It was dedicated to the goddess Diana and served by a priest who took office only by killing the previous man to hold the job. Frazer claims to have found the explanation for this bizarre tradition in a formerly universal human custom of being ruled by sacred kings, representing the spirit of vegetation on which farming depended. These were, according to Frazer, ritually killed and replaced, either when their natural powers began to wane or after a fixed number of years, such as 7. It's pretty obvious from the start that one obscure Roman rite was not the real focus of Frazer's interest. Instead, he was gunning for Christianity by suggesting that Jesus Christ had been one of those sacred kings, and that the whole story of his crucifixion and resurrection arose out of a misunderstanding of this bloodthirsty, ignorant, and pointless ancient pagan tradition. In the first edition of the Golden Bough, he made this argument implicit, if pretty obvious. In the second, he was explicit, though he tried to protect himself by stating that devout Christians could still see the ancient tradition as instituted by the Christian God to prepare the minds of people for his incarnation as Christ. It didn't work, and the book received heavy criticism, not just from outraged Christians, lots of them, but from academic colleagues who pointed out the gaps in Frazer's reasoning. In the third edition, therefore, he ran scared and cut out the explicit argument, leaving readers to make the association for themselves if they wanted. Nonetheless, to the end of his life, he never missed an opportunity to snipe at Christianity by comparing aspects of it to savage beliefs. My fourth theme in his life is elitism. Frazer was an ingrained, and to a liberal like me, sometimes frankly appalling elitist. Specifically, he was a vehement meritocrat, believing that in every generation there are born a small minority of people who by their gifts are destined to improve the lot of their fellow humans and rule over them with the most unlimited possible power. He regarded all the advances in the human condition as having been made by these few exceptional thinkers, with the masses or even whole communities playing no part in them at all. He wrote that, I'm going to start quoting him a lot, and rather than say quote, unquote, I'm going to go into a cod Scottish accent. Whenever I do this, you'll know I'm quoting Frazer. It's an economical way of doing it. I have a lot of Scottish blood, so I can get away with it. He wrote that the attempt to explain history without the influence of great men may flatter the vanity of the vulgar, but it will find no favor with the philosophic historian. This was because the dull, the weak, the ignorant, and the superstitious constitute, unfortunately, the vast majority of mankind. He accordingly thought that democracy was an inferior system of government to dictatorship by a gifted and enlightened ruler. The rise of one man to supreme power enables him to carry out changes in a single lifetime, which previously many generations might not have sufficed to effect. Nor was he squeamish about the methods by which his dictators could get to the top. Many men who have been the least scrupulous in the acquisition of power have been the most beneficent in the use of it. He had no time for any hereditary aristocracy. His rulers would be selected by rigorous and intense competition, which only the very best out of each age group would win by outcompeting the others by whatever methods were necessary. However, Frazer did not in practice believe that the minority of gifted people who were destined to rule the majority were drawn equally from all classes and races. Instead, his prejudices were all in favor of his own people, the white male bourgeoisie. He despised non-European races, believing that the minority, writing that civilization varies on the whole directly with complexion, increasing or diminishing with the blanching of the skin. That's how white you are. However, his contempt for the white working class, and especially the rural working class, was just as profound. The truth seems to be that to this day, the peasant remains a pagan and a savage at heart. His civilization is merely a thin veneer, which the hard knocks of life soon abrade, exposing the solid core of paganism and savagery below. The danger created by a bottomless layer of ignorance and superstition beneath the crust of civilized society is lessened not only by the natural torpidity and inertia of the rural mind, but also by the progressive decrease of the rural combined with the urban population in modern states. In other words, the good news was that both primitive peoples elsewhere in the world and rural commoners in Europe were destined inevitably to be exterminated by the progressive forces of modernization. Nor did he think that anybody should mourn the disappearance in the face of modernity of the colorful rural folk customs which his book portrayed in such number and detail. These pretty pageants, these now innocent diversions, had their origin in ignorance and superstition. He saw academics like himself as having the same role in regulating and educating the masses as justices of the peace had over the domestic working class and colonial officials had over non-European peoples. However, he also remained very afraid of those masses, believing that they could erupt at any moment and sweep away the whole of civilization. We seem to move on a thin crust, which may at any moment be rent by the subterranean forces slumbering below in the masses. I don't think it's possible to excuse Frazer in holding these attitudes by saying he was a man of his time. Even for his age, and especially for a British intellectual, his opinions were unusually and rabidly right-wing. In particular, they were the antithesis of those held by his father, a radical liberal who believed in the advancement of democracy. Frazer was not a conventional racist in one respect. He genuinely liked Jews and admired their culture. Nor was he a dictator to younger anthropologists, making no attempt to force his own views upon them. And indeed, he was always willing to change the details of his views, though never his main beliefs, in response to new evidence. So he was not an anti-Semite, and he was not a personal tyrant. Nonetheless, in his political and social attitudes, he could not unreasonably be described as a fascist. So that was the man. It's time to look at the book. Its reconstruction of a once universal ancient religion based on sacrificed sacred kings was made by mixing together evidence from three different sources. The first were the accounts of pagan practices made by ancient authors, above all Greek and Roman. The second consisted of those recorded among tribal peoples in the modern world by European travelers, missionaries, and colonial officials. Frazer believed that these so-called primitives had retained customs which had been universal in ancient times. His third source comprised accounts of folk rites and beliefs recorded in modern Europe among the common people, especially rural people. You may remember that Frazer regarded country folk as being as backward as the tribes of Africa, South Asia, and the Pacific. Although Christianity was Frazer's main target, he was still disgusted by ancient paganism, which he associated with ignorance and savagery. He made his reconstructed universal archetype of it a medley of bloodshed, sex, and sensual self-indulgence. In the process, he provided readers with a huge catalogue of rituals and customs, which were frequently colourful to the point of being lurid. They included human sacrifice, sacred prostitutions, ritual nudity, and festive orgies. It should be emphasized that examples of these are actually a lot more numerous in the Golden Bough than they ever were in reality. This is because of Frazer's habit of interpreting innocent folk and tribal customs from his own time, like mock beheadings, burnings of effigies, or crowning of May queens and kings as relics of once brutal and lascivious ancient rites. The knock-on irony is that whereas he expected his readers to be appalled and repelled by paganism as a religion of sex and violence, many were entertained, titillated, and excited. Some found in his descriptions, in varying proportions, a prurient, a sensuous, and a romantic pleasure. Even during Frazer's lifetime, fellow scholars, whether classicists, historians, or anthropologists, were starting to reject his theories as based on faulty use of evidence and faulty logic. After his death, he became one of the most reviled and discarded of writers among his fellow academics. Two of the foundations of his comparative method were rotten. One was his assumption that the human mind, and therefore human beliefs, evolved in the same way all over the world as animal species, human anatomy, and human languages did. It was a very common assumption in the 19th century. It resulted in the hypothesis that myths, legends, and religious doctrine, as I've said, could be formed into worldwide family trees like animal and plant species. And this generated another, that prehistoric beliefs and rituals can be reconstructed from later forms, even as ancient languages can. This has turned out simply not to be the case. Human beliefs seem to develop in much more independent, capricious, contingent, and opportunistic ways. If the same custom, doctrine, or rite was found both in ancient Rome and modern Indonesia, this does not necessarily mean that both must have descended from a common prehistoric ancestor. Now that the history of popular customs has increasingly been written, moreover, it turns out that rural Europeans did not, as Frazer and his predecessors supposed, mindlessly act out the same customs century after century. On the contrary, illiterate people are often more willing and able to change beliefs and customs than those who've preserved them in writing. Rural commoners were just as inclined to get bored with doing the same things as anybody else does, and also constantly interacted with social elites and townspeople. Above all, modern recent scholarship values two tactics which Frazer almost completely disregarded. One is to check the reliability of sources. If they suited his arguments, Frazer accepted on face value the most lurid and unreliable of travelers' tales, myths, and legends, and the claims that ancient or tribal peoples made about the habits of their enemies as objective truth. The other tactic is to put material in its own proper context. Frazer not only ignored this, but sometimes contemptuously dismissed it. For example, he explained the two-headed image of the Roman god Janus by imposing on it an explanation given by former black slaves in Suriname, South Africa, for their own two-headed god. He was aware the Romans themselves had cited different reasons for their image, but dismissed those as tedious and unsatisfactory, without bothering to explain why, or indeed to tell readers what the Romans had actually said. I'd still like to end, however, by explaining why I think the Golden Bough still has value. I'd suggest that it does so in two different ways. One is that Frazer's comparative method, in my opinion, retains utility. In doing so, I'm entering controversy, because for most of the 20th century, anthropologists generally denied this. They insisted that every human society is unique, and so must be studied in its own terms, without drawing comparison. This was a massive reaction against the excessive facility with which Frazer and his predecessors had done so. But it also empowered individual anthropologists as the only experts on the particular traditional peoples whom each of them had studied. This meant, of course, that they were the only scholars with the right to speak for those peoples or about them, and had a good claim to jobs. That assertion has been challenged from within anthropology since the 1990s, as it has been recognized that certain communal problems are besetting the world, and the developing world in particular, and need to be studied across it. One of these is, of course, environmental degradation by industry, but another is witch hunting. I have myself made a sustained attack on the idea that the comparative method is worthless, especially in the case of witch persecution. And I think that so far I've won that argument. Moreover, some of Frazer's own comparisons do seem to stand up. The most important of these is his classification of magic worldwide into sympathetic and contagious. I don't think these are the only categories for magic, but I think they are categories that work. If you make a wax image of somebody to work magic on that person, which looks like them, that is sympathetic magic. If you steal that person's nail or hair clippings and put them into the image, then it becomes contagious magic, relying on objects which have been in contact with the person concerned. Frazer produced excellent evidence that both ideas are found all over the world. And the second enduring value of the Golden Bough is as creative literature. In other words, if you treat it as a work of fiction, often drawing on materials taken from apparent fact, then it's a powerful and effective, and often grisly, work of art. As such, it's been immensely influential, both on apparently creative writers, on explicitly creative writers, and on people who are not. Whole books have been written about the influence of the Golden Bough, so I'd hardly need to say more. But in the early 20th century, explicitly creative writers included not just T.S. Eliot and Wyndham Lewis, but W.B. Yeats and D.H. Lawrence. In the late 20th century, to cherry pick, the Golden Bough lies behind the cult movie, The Wicker Man, the best-selling novel, The Da Vinci Code, and the comic strip Schloinia in the 1980s cult magazine, 2000 AD. Its emphasis upon works of ostensible non-fiction, like Robert Graves's The White Goddess, Margaret Murray's The Divine King in England, is obvious, and both Graves and Murray were fundamental to the creation of modern paganism, especially Wicca. That paganism is creatively and very effectively, very productively saturated with ideas and images from the Golden Bough, both filtered through Graves and Murray and absorbed directly. Gerald Gardner, the founder of Wicca, believed completely in Murray's ideas, and so in Frazer's, Alexander's, the king of the witches, took as his initiatory witch name, something drawn from the Golden Bough. When Alex died and a character called Kevin Carlyon tried to assume the title of King of the Witches, other Wiccans told him they'd accept him as their monarch if they could sacrifice him after 7 years. Everybody understood the reference. In many ways, the book has taken over from its author. Its ideas have become so embedded in modern culture that many people no longer recognize their origin. Even those who still know the book, however, rarely have any knowledge of the shy, intense little man who wrote it. Given many of Frazer's opinions and motivations, however, that obscurity may be no bad thing. I rest my case.
Thank you very much.